Russia's not a nation state, it's a multi-ethnic empire. And the way it's always defended itself is by turning all of the nations that border it into cannon fodder. And so there aren't a lot of people in Russia who want to be there unless they're ethnically Russian. Even there, it's a little touch and go. So there are 70 significant minorities, and most of those are Turkic of some flavor, the larger ones, the Tatars, the Bashkirs, the Chechens, the Dagestanis, and so on. So there's a really, really fertile ground for radical ideas that are related to Islam in some way. And then if you go out from beyond the Russian Federation to the former Soviet Union, you're getting the Kazakhs and the Tajiks and the Azerbaijanis and all the rest. So best guess at the moment, judging from what's been going on in the chatter in the jihadi community, is it was the Islamic State Khorasan, which is a splinter group of ISIS that just thinks ISIS are a bunch of pussies. And that they should just get down to the real deal of executing everyone who doesn't believe that the way that they do, starting with either non-Muslim governments that oppress Muslims or Shia. So their first two really big attacks, one was in Kabul as the American withdrawal was happening. They didn't attack us, they attacked the Taliban, because the Taliban, they also say, are a bunch of pussies. And then they went after the Iranians in January. And now they've gone after the Russians. So these are not particularly nice people. And what sets them apart from most other jihadi groups is they have no interest in holding territory at all. They're just all about the retribution. From the people that the Russians captured, tortured, and paraded on television, it looks like the people who did the attack were Tajik specifically. And there aren't a lot of Tajiks outside of Tajikistan. So it looks like ISIS Khorasan is already operating with relative impunity within the former Soviet world. Now, for the Putin government, which has basically said, I'm the only way to keep you safe, they got a private warning from the United States 7 weeks ago that we had been hearing chatter from ISIS Khorasan about doing an attack on a concert hall in Moscow. We shared that immediately, and they ignored it. So 3 weeks ago, we said it publicly, specifically warning any Americans who are in the area, just don't go to a concert for now. And then the Russians poo-pooed it publicly, saying that this was an American attempt to destabilize and we're a perfectly harmonious society and blah, 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 blah. And then the attack happened. So the propaganda machine had been going full tilt in the direction of there's not an attack and the Americans are idiots, to all of a sudden, oh shit, this was all an American triple bypass play that was designed to do it's a ridiculous line of propaganda that is not getting any traction within the former Soviet world. And it's really showcased that Putin has basically put everything that the government is capable of doing for security issues into the war and left everything else naked. So this is bad, because there are a lot of people living in the former Soviet world who really hate Moscow. Good propaganda always has a kernel of truth in it somewhere, but that's usually where it ends. In the case of Tucker specifically, he's been a Russian shill for about 8 years.
Can you describe that?
He has been accepting money from the Russian government to push the Russian position in Western media for 8 years. Okay. And after he got fired from Fox, keep in mind, Tucker's been fired from every journalist job he's ever had because he makes stuff up. And so when he got let go from Fox, it became apparent that even UAN wasn't going to hire him because he wasn't reliable. He went to Moscow because that was his only job opportunity left. And he did that interview, which was just weird. When we started the digital revolution back in the 1980s, everybody got a fax. And it used to be that every news outlet in the world had a series of foreign bureaus that had stringers, reporters, copy editors, editors. When the fax came along, they gutted all the copy editors because you just send messages back. Then the fax gave way to email, and the email gave way to attachments, and they got rid of all of the stringers and all the journalists. And they would just send journalists on reporting troops every once in a while. So if you remember back when, wow, you guys are way too young. When 9/11 happened, all Western media combined had one reporter on the ground in Afghanistan. And that one guy, Nathan something or other, became the face of America in Afghanistan when we were engaged in our first real war in decades, because that's all there was. And then we got social media. And everyone could be a reporter, but nobody needed a record or fact check. So we now have algorithms and AI that are writing stories. So basically, every foreign bureau of almost every media reporting agency in the world has been closed down with a handful of exceptions for places like that are just huge, like the New York Times, and they focus on finance. So all the chances we used to have in the publishing process, having eyes on a situation and brains looking at a situation, uh, for gathering the facts, for crafting them into a story, for fact checking on the back end, that's all gone. And so in the United States, not just the United States, across the world, most media now is just some person in the home country with an opinion. And Tucker's operated very well in that environment. The only two institutions that are left that do it the old way. The first one is Al Jazeera out of the Persian Gulf, because they're like, we're not journalists. We don't know what we're doing. So what we're going to do is if something happens, we're going to send some people there to look around and tell you what we see. And if it doesn't make sense to us, we're going to talk to different people and report what they see. And we used to call that journalism. And the second one is France 24, because it is an old state-style funded issue that's not worried about profitability and eyes and clicks. Now, they're not perfect. In both cases, ignore any reporting they do on their home region, because then all of a sudden that journalistic neutrality goes out the window. It's like Al Jazeera's like, we don't know what's going on in South America, so we're going to report. But if it happens in the Middle East, we totally know what's happening in the Middle East. Let us tell you what's going down in the Middle East. And they're just no better than MSNBC or Fox. And the same thing for France or Europe. But those are the only ones that are left. I would love to be able to give you a definitive source. The problem is something called the 1996 Telecommunications Act, which basically says that anyone who publishes anything, no matter where it comes from, no matter who's repeating it, you're not liable for accuracy. They did that so that the web services companies could get started and wouldn't get sued for being the communicators of the information, even if they had no say in its creation. But it's been carried to a point of view that that accuracy is just not a value, and there's no legal requirement that anyone provides accuracy. Until that act is amended, this is the situation we're in. I'd love to tell you that there's a place to go, but basically you have to develop a very, very, very good bullshit detector. Good starting point. Anything that Tucker says is a lie. Oh God, no! It's certainly not going to happen in this Congress. That's some thorny work. Everybody agrees that it needs to be amended or repealed. No one agrees on what they want to replace it with, because the conservatives are convinced they're being silenced. So are the liberals. It's a mess. It will continue until the day that the Russians lose the ability to fight. The soonest, let me rephrase that. From a manpower point of view, that's 2032. That's the point where they simply run out of men in their 20s to theoretically even throw into the fight. So that's the outside. It could happen sooner based on what happens to logistical systems. I don't think it's a sanctions issue. Excuse me. I don't think it's a sanctions issue. It's a question of whether or not the Russians are physically capable of bringing material and men to the front. So if the Ukrainians manage to take out, say, the Kerch Strait Bridge, then they can't resupply the Crimea at all, and all of a sudden half of the occupied territory turns into a giant shield of exposure for the Russians. That could really change the math. Another possibility, what the Ukrainians are doing right now with using long and short-range drones to target Russian refineries, is having a very real impact on the ability of the Russians to process crude. And the Russian pipeline system is not like the American system. If the crude can't get out, if it sits in the pipes, Russia's winters are no joke, and they last until June. If they freeze, then the pipes stop working all the way back to the wellheads in Siberia. And if the wells freeze because there's nothing moving, you have to re-drill those wells. So when you had that sort of backup in 1989 to 1992, it took the Russians 30 years to get back to their Cold War levels of oil production. That would destroy their income stream. Oil is the single largest line item for them for income. And without that income, the Chinese and North Koreans, for example, Iran, aren't going to be supplying them with equipment. That's a different sort of war.